who, I should add, is one of the pillars of the national committees on foreign relations, the American Committees on Foreign Relations. Dick?
Thank you. It's always interesting to be described as a pillar. If I understand pillars correctly, they are tall, rigid, and usually have stone at the top. That may well describe. You've been in the field perhaps too long when your introduction increasingly sounds like your obituary. It's reached the point where time after time when I go to speak, someone comes to me and says, so you're Dick Millett. I thought you were dead. But yeah, you're right. I have testified before Congress on all too many occasions, and there gets to be a certain sort of similarity there. Whenever I be talking about chaos any place in Latin America, I'd always get the same question from one member of the committee, which would be, all right, who's responsible for the mess in this area? Who created all this? And I'd always have the same answer, which was Hernan Cortés. And there'd always be another member of the committee who wanted to subpoena him. Oddly enough, unfortunately, there is some truth to that, the throwaway line out. But the degree of ignorance which we often have about both the history and contemporary realities of the rest of this hemisphere is hard to exaggerate. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is to talk about Mexico in particular, and about 10 points I want to make about Mexico. We'll do this fairly quick. I'd like to leave a lot of time for questions and answers, and for those who've gone to sleep to wake up. The things you won't get from the media, but I do want to make a tiny, and I guarantee you not financially interesting. I have a new book, came out just a few months ago, from the Combat Studies Institute at Leavenworth, Searching for Stability. It is a series of case studies of the U.S. efforts to create military and police forces in this hemisphere and the Philippines. But the conclusion chapter, and the reason the Army paid me very nicely to write this, is pointed very directly at Iraq and Afghanistan. There is an amazingly little literature on our efforts to create other people's armies. And now the good news. You can download the entire book free off the internet. Just put in my name, Richard Millett, with 2 T's, plus Searching for Stability, or go to the Combat Studies Institute Press at Leavenworth, and you'll find it. And you can download the whole thing. Or, especially if you're with the government, you can write the Combat Studies Institute, and they will send you a copy. They are incredibly anxious to get rid of them. When you're dealing with Latin America in general, with Mexico in particular, there are a lot of things that are kind of hard for Americans to understand. We often like to talk about the Americas, the things that unite us, and yet in many ways our historical heritages are amazingly different. For instance, when I talk about the military, I like to point out that in the United States, the military arose out of the militia tradition, and the military was there to defend the people. In Mexico, much of Latin America, not Brazil, interestingly, but much of it, it came out of what we call the tradition of the conquistador, where it was there to protect the state and control the people. And the idea that the people could be the enemy of the state was very deeply ingrained in the Latin American tradition. This is a very, very different way of looking at things. In the US, we traditionally, although it kind of makes us uncomfortable, but if you live in a country where it's the other way, you get less uncomfortable. We've always said that, look, you've got to balance order and justice. And on the whole, we preferred justice. We've said it's better to let several guilty people go than to imprison one innocent person. And in Latin America, the assumption has been the other way, especially if the people imprisoned do not come from any important social class or family. This is, as the Central America's most distinguished international lawyer was Carlos Alberto Reina, who later became president of Honduras. And we were talking shortly before he became president about this, and he said, you know, Richard, you have to understand that in our countries, you have to understand that in our countries, the criminal law is applied to the poor and the powerful are immune. And the civil law is accessible to the rich and the poor have no access. So the next time you get upset about contingency fees, think about the alternative. This was, I think, the most profoundly, by a man who became president of this country, simple but accurate description I've heard. So when you look at things like the drug war in Mexico, you have to understand this heritage. You have to understand the philosophical assumptions, if you will. There are phrases in Spanish which, if you know the culture, make a lot of sense, but they're not the kind of things we would use at all. For example, you say in Spanish all the time, mejor el diablo conocido que el diablo desconocido. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Which simply assumes that your choice is between devils. Or if I was discussing these issues in Spanish, which I do, I would use probably half a dozen times tonight the phrase menos mal, less bad. You go your entire life in English and never say that. You may occasionally talk about the lesser of two evils, but that's very rare and very specific. Menos mal is constant in Spanish, used all the time, because there's no assumption that there is a good alternative out there. But let me start off now on a little more positive note with the first of my 10 points. I don't usually like to do 10. I usually I learn in front of the Congress, if you try to give them more than 2 ideas, you've lost them. What's the old saying that if pro is the opposite of con, what is the opposite of progress? Takes a while to figure that out, obviously Congress. The first thing is very bluntly, Mexico is not a failed state. Now you're going to hear this babble occasionally. Mexico has deep problems. Mexico's always had deep problems. But the Mexican state functions reasonably well in most areas. Mexico is doing better economically than we are. It has recovered much faster. Indeed, Latin America has recovered much faster than we have. And incidentally, for those of you looking at broader hemispheric things, not only did Latin America recover faster than the U.S., but it did it for the first time in its history without anybody really inflating the currency. That's an amazing change. That's a sea change. Mexico is not a failed state. And Calderon's efforts to deal with the drug dealers and the cartels may fail, but that won't mean that Mexico as a state fails. It will mean that his party's replaced and that the traditional Mexican way of cutting deals will resume. We'll get to that later. Are there high levels of violence in Mexico? Yes, yeah. We've seen 30,000 people killed in the last couple of years. But the death rate from murder is much higher in Venezuela. Chavez doesn't like to talk about that. But the public obviously knows it. That showed up in the recent congressional elections. The murder rate's always been higher in El Salvador. There are many more violent countries than Mexico. Mexico's worst violence is concentrated in a few places. Do not go to Juarez. Period, exclamation point. There are some very dangerous places. There are some very safe places. I will still walk around at night in Mérida, for example, in Yucatan. It all depends on where you are. And within, in the U.S. there's a lot of parts of the city like St. Louis that I won't walk around in at night. So, it's not a failed state. It's not the most violent state in the world. It is not a state that is run by the cartels. The cartels don't really want to run it. They just want to have a free hand to do whatever it is they want to do. Secondly, The U.S.-Mexican border is unique. I don't know how much of you thought about this. There is nothing like it on this planet in terms of a long land frontier between a developed and a less developed country. There aren't any. Depending on how you define parts of Eastern Europe, you know, these are transition areas. You know, even the Greek-Turkish border, which is very short, you know, is between the most developed part of Turkey and the least developed part of Greece. Israel's borders come maybe the closest, but they're mined. There's nothing like this on the planet. And that produces some very peculiar challenges and some interesting opportunities. But it is an absolutely unique phenomenon. Point 3, corruption in Mexico is far from universal. I think sometimes we get that impression, you know, that everybody in Mexico must be corrupt. You know. If they're all corrupt, how so many officials are getting murdered? You know? That would be an interesting question to ask. Wait a minute. I go down every few months and do some teaching with the Mexican police and military. Yeah. And occasionally you're tempted to use the joke line that when you're teaching about international crime, you're not sure whether you're teaching how to fight it or how to do it. But I deal especially with the mid-level, upper mid-level people. These guys are serious. They're frustrated. They're angry, but they are. They've all had friends killed by the druggies, and they take that personally. Yes, there is a lot of first of all, some of what we define as corruption, they wouldn't exactly define that way. Your salaries are often, especially for municipal local police, very low. You're expected to supplement them. You know, the courts are not there to handle these kind of things anyway, so if you want to save the court the trouble by collecting the fine personally. But that may often not be seen as corruption. Using your jobs to make sure that your relatives get jobs. Now, in the U.S., if you do that, you go to Leavenworth for the long course, not the short one, at the Command and Staff College, the other institution on the hill. Now, in Latin America, if you don't use your position to hire your relatives, you are what they could call a sinvergüenza, another one of those nice words that doesn't really translate. You know, you're shameless. You're without shame. But it's not like shameless in English, has no sexual, it means you're without honor. We had one poor party that tried it, the Christian Democrats in Panama. They got to office and tried to hire qualified people instead of those they voted for them. And in one election, they went from the biggest party in their Congress to one seat. You're dealing with a very different history and tradition. And you've got to understand it. So first of all, some of what we would define as corruption, they wouldn't. Secondly, as I said, many people are not corrupt. We've recently, I go to Monterrey. We've recently seen 2 mayors just outside of Monterrey murdered for refusing to take bribes. Honest politicians. We've seen an incredible toll of journalists, which again gets almost no publicity in this country. But an amazing amount of Mexican journalists have been murdered for doing their job. And some people, and here I would say if I was in a position, I'd do the same thing. The cartels are very good at offering you what we call plata o plomo, silver or lead. You take the money or you take the lead. And they're very good, but not necessarily you. They will do things like send you a picture of your kids leaving school. How many of you at this point would courageously stand up? You've got to understand the alternatives too, before we get too judgmental. Yes, corruption's an issue. It's a problem. But it is not the problem. It is a symptom of many other problems, including the amazing amount of U.S. money that finances the drug trade. Fourth, immigration is nothing like the issue that some people are trying to make of it in this campaign. It's declined steadily with the U.S. economic decline, as loyal as remittances. There are even some indications that maybe more people going back to Mexico than coming over the last year or two. If you want to see some dangerous criminalized immigration, you might want to look at some of what comes out of China, for example. But Mexico, the immigration is not the major issue. Most of the great majority of those who immigrate are not criminals. Now, there is a paradox here. I had lunch with the #2 guy in the Border Patrol a couple of years ago. We were talking about precisely this. You know, he points out, the more we squeeze the borders, the more people are forced into the hands of organized crime to get here. The more they may become mules. They may swallow condoms full of heroin, for example, which occasionally burst with inevitably instant fatal effects. They may be brought in here for prostitution. We recently stopped an entire busload of Salvadoran prostitutes just outside of Washington, D.C. There are rumors the Congress was not happy with those arrests, but we won't go into that. Immigration, again, is a symptom, and you cannot close the borders today. If you want to put the American auto industry completely out of business, try to close down the borders. Try to search everything that comes across. If you want to eat spoiled fruit every day, you know, let's start inspecting everything that comes across. But our biggest problem isn't so much what comes across the Mexican border, is what comes across through container ships. And we don't inspect most of that, and we can't, without, again, totally paralyzing the port of Newark, among other places. We simply don't understand enough the consequences of a globalized economy for things like this. You can't control your borders. You can't seal them. You've got to depend on very good intel to have much of any control. And this brings me to another point. It may not be a separate one, but it kind of fits in here. There's a lot of concern about what if terrorists start coming across the Mexican border. Now, if you actually notice, the real cases we've seen have come across the Canadian border. For some reason, we don't blame all the Canadians for this. Well, you know, there's good news and there's bad news. I love good news, bad news jokes. You know the one about the guy in the terrible auto accident, the doctor comes in and says, I have bad news, but I have good news. Doctor, what's the bad news? Your legs are hopelessly crushed. We've got to amputate them both at the knee. Ah! What's the good news? I have a friend who wants to buy all your shoes. This is not what we call an equitable balance. In this case, there is some equity. You know. Is there some danger? Yeah. But I'll tell you, it scares the Mexican government and it scares the drug cartels more than it scares us. Because this would be really bad for business. They will turn in anybody they might suspect as a terrorist. And it's kind of hard for the average, you know, Middle Eastern immigrant to pose as a Mexican. The only dumber thing was something John Bolton once suggested, that they might come in as Haitian immigrants. I thought that was, you know, they're going to all go learn Creole, you know, become emaciated, and then get on a boat with 80 other people that's designed to hold 6, you know, and will probably sink before they get there. That's certainly the way they want to come. But there really is, you know, if you want to get good intel on any possibility of somebody trying to cross the Mexican border, you'll get it from the cartels. Because they know the effect this would have on the, you know, you want to see us really be forced to slam the border with all its bad, you know. You want to see us really go after this kind of stuff, that would do it. The Canadians don't seem as worried. And I love working with Canadians. Point 5. Oh boy, too many points, huh? Drugs are not the only problem, and for Mexicans are not the principal one. Mexicans are victims of massive waves of common crime and of kidnappings. And if you want to know what upsets and scares a Mexican, it's not drug trafficking, it's kidnapping. And some of this are the same people being involved. And the victims are Mexicans. So, and there's also auto trafficking, and there's the huge trade of arms coming from the US to Mexico. And there's an article in today's Washington Post precisely on that. You might want to go check it out on the online, it's there. Yeah. The huge amount of guns that go from the US to Mexico, especially when we dropped most regulations on assault rifles. This became a major issue. The Mexicans keep begging us to do something about it. We did something about it. We've given them, for example, a very sophisticated computer program, but we took 2 years to translate it into Spanish. And so far, I think we've trained 3 Mexicans on how to use it. So there's guilt that runs both ways. Point 6. Most of those who've been killed, bluntly, have been people involved in the drug trade. This is criminals killing criminals. So the slaughter in places like water, the danger is always you can be where the gunfire goes off and you don't want to be there. Or you can become a victim of a kidnapping. I've got a friend who was kidnapped in Mexico, Canadian. It can happen. One of these drive him around, make him take all the money out of the ATMs, and they didn't know how good Spanish he spoke. Probably Canada's best Latin American specialist. They started debating whether they should kill him and calling their chief, whom he's convinced was a police official. But part of what's happened is we have seen incredibly violent conflicts between the various Mexican drug running organizations, cartels, over transport routes into the US. And we've seen these groups split. One good thing in the world is that often the people we don't like each other very much either. And can busily engage in killing each other instead of focusing on us. Some of these groups are really nasty. There's a group which has quasi-religious overtones, based especially in the state of Michoacan, called La Familia, which is really a very frightening group. There are Los Zetas. The Zetas were originally recruited by the Gulf Cartel as their hitmen. They were ex-Mexican military, and then they began to recruit more and more ex-Guatemalan military who had more combat experience. But the Zetas are now breaking with the Gulf Cartel and in fact shooting some of its people and becoming a cartel on their own. And these guys are all heavily trained in combat and in the use of heavier and heavier weapons. That is a very frightening group. But again, understand that an awful lot of what you hear are cartels fighting cartels. Point 7. This is one, again, we'd go back to what I was talking about with my friend Carlos Alberto Reina from Honduras. The failure of justice is more a cause than a result of the situation. The justice system for most people has never worked and never been expected to work. Again, Mexico's long-term dictator Porfirio Diaz used to have a saying, translates well into English, but to most Americans doesn't make any sense, but boy, it makes sense to Mexicans, he would say. For my friends, justice, for my enemies, the law. We tend to think of that as the same thing. No, it's not. The law is designed so you can convict anybody you want to, or release anybody you want to. And so part of what we have, not just in Mexico, and I mean, this certainly is the state, for example, in Afghanistan, in much of Iraq, in an awful lot of Africa, in most of Latin America. We tend to think of crime as being a problem of law enforcement. That's the popular American view. You need tougher laws and more jails or something. It's a problem of a state of chronic lawlessness. And this is not because people have never had any reason to respect the law. In Spanish, you cannot really translate things like rule of law. In America, we talk about the courts producing justice. In Spanish, it only administrar la justicia. It administers it. It doesn't produce it. There are no blind justice statutes outside of Latin American courts, and nobody's holding a scale. This has never been. The justice was all, the administration of justice, courts, police, prisons, etc., were always the arm of the executive branch to control the population and dispose of their enemies. They were there for order, not justice. Now, when you transition to democracy, and this is something, again, that we have a hard time dealing with, there seemed to be a view in some circles that, when you got rid of the dictatorship or that, everybody would join hands, sing Kumbaya, and want the rule of law. They have, what it means is if the state starts to protect some of your rights, it can't convict anybody. Conviction rates have fallen in some Mexican states and some Central American countries below 5%, which means, among other things, you just don't take people to court. Right? You put them in jail and forget them. People have never seen the cop on the corner as being there to defend them. Incidentally, the view in our inner cities is very similar. The policeman isn't there for me, he's there to whop me upside the head. I've had students tell me that. I talk about it in Latin America, and my middle-class suburban students will go, "Ah!" And my inner city African-American students would say, "So what's new?" That's reality. Again, that's not there for you. And you have what I call the Gordian knot then. If the police don't work, if they're corrupt, underpaid, undertrained, intimidated, how can you expect the courts to work? If the courts don't work, how can you expect the police to work? And where do you begin to cut the Gordian knot? And this is another huge problem. When you have a federal system like Mexico's, again, one problem in Latin America has often been that all the police and all the courts were run by the central government. Mexico's had a federal system. One change in recent years has been more and more power has flowed to the states and away from the traditional presidency. But this has simply led to even more problems of anybody trying to find honest and efficient law enforcement. And the prisons, we have an annual security conference for the U.S. Southern Command down in Miami that I usually go to. And a couple of years ago, we had former head of the Colombian National Police, country doesn't matter in this case, doing a PowerPoint presentation on the fuentes de la delincuencia, the sources of delinquency, of crime. And he had this about dozen, and number 5 on his list was the prison system. It wasn't a cure, it was a source, which it is. It is so often in this country too. This is where you get your postgraduate degree in criminal practice. We do have a good thing. We put people in there, give them the postgraduate education, then deport them. So they go back much more sophisticated than they left. The prisons produce criminals, the courts often barely function, and the police are intimidated or often corrupt or both. The justice system doesn't work. The Mexicans are making real efforts to change this. It is a mammoth task because you have a population that doesn't believe in it. Eight, while the U.S. and Mexico in this struggle often see common enemies, they have in some ways very different agendas. What the U.S. wants to do is keep Mexican crime out of the U.S. What the Mexicans want to do is, first of all, provide more opportunities for their own youth so they'll have something other than crime, which means not closing our border. The more we close our border, the more you plugged up the safety valve on the boiler. Something that, again, is almost never thought of in this country. But bluntly, their problem is, first of all, the threat these groups have come to pose to the state. They've gotten that strong. And secondly, the lack of citizen security for the average Mexican. We'd like to focus on drug trafficking. They want to focus on the whole range, including very much things like arms smuggling, people smuggling, and especially kidnapping. So we have different sorts of agendas here, very different, at times a bit conflictive. You need also to understand that because of history, what the U.S. can do for Mexico, well, maybe they're better off. Our great efforts to solve other countries' internal security problems, as reflected by the great success we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan. You may be better off if we do less. I'm not sure on this one, but you can't. Mexico, for very real reasons, has deep suspicions of the U.S. and strong barrier. They like the U.S. to help, but they've got to keep it as quiet as possible, and please don't talk about it. And if we share intel and it helps us catch somebody, don't you say a word, and for heaven's sakes, please don't take part. And don't call it Plan Management, so it'll sound like Plan Colombia. And don't say that because it's your money you don't have to consult the Mexican Congress. We've managed to do all those things in case that doesn't come as a great surprise. There, again, good old Porfirio Diaz, the long-term dictator, who's not a Mexican hero, but who's often quoted, would say that, Pobre México que lejos de Dios y que cerca de los Estados Unidos. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. And there was a reason for him saying that. So understand this. Our agenda is often different. We have common enemies, but our ability to confront them is difficult. And the corruption is on this side of the border, and it's spreading steadily. There's a big upsurge in kidnappings, for example, in Phoenix. Now don't worry, it's mostly Mexicans being kidnapped by Mexicans to date. You can probably still go there this winter. Maybe. But corruption involves everybody. We've seen now corruptions in things like the DEA. We see especially in things like local sheriff's offices. Some of it, again, is money. Some of it is plata o plomo. Some of it is simply figuring it doesn't make a difference what you do anyway. But it's not just there. It's here, and it's growing. And most of the profits from the drug trade stay here. Mexicans aren't selling this stuff to American kids. They aren't, they may do a lot of the transporting, but the sales are being done by Americans, or by U.S. street gangs especially. And that's another story, which we probably don't have time to get into. And finally, if Calderon's government fails, if he loses the election in 2012, which at the moment seems likely, if his party, he can't run. Mexico will not let you run for a second term. That is El Sagrado Sexenio, the sacred 6 years, and heaven help anybody who tries to change that. The last person who tried to change it was assassinated, Alvaro Obregón, and that was in the 20s. They take that quite seriously. His party is likely to lose. The old ruling party, the PRI, the PRI, we pronounce it that way in Mexico, is likely to come back. And they have a long tradition of making deals with these people rather than trying to eliminate them. And some of the deals, there have literally been offers already at state levels by some of the drug cartels that if the state will stop interfering with their drug business, they'll kill the kidnappers. Vigilante type justice. But look who the vigilantes are. So things will change. The security of the average Mexican is not likely to go up very much, and the amount of drugs crossing the border is not likely to change. We do a lot, there's a lot of efforts, but in terms of stuff, first of all, we haven't seen much of any impact on the street price. I love to quote Steve Flynn. Steve, for years with the Council on Foreign Relations, the best expert on port and security and that. And Steve once said, if you want to smuggle a nuclear device in the U.S., the best way to make sure to get it here is to hide it in a shipment of cocaine. I may leave you with that thought tonight. Mexico's problems are our problems. We are linked at the hip. They can't move away from us, and we can't move away from them. We have increasingly an important segment of our own population that has ties there. You cannot now, this is something that has changed in my lifetime profoundly. You can't go to a village any place in the most remote part of Mexico, I don't think, and not have that village have somebody in the United States. You've reached that point of really no return on this. And you need to understand that. We've got to find, first of all, more effective ways to understand each other, to understand the nature of the problems, the limitations, what we can do, the questions about what we can do about our own consumption, which is a huge issue, but bluntly, how to avoid making each other's difficulties just that much more difficult. Thank you very much. We have someone who's awake.
Sir, on my way over here this evening, I heard about 5 different commentators who were raging about the decision that was made by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to allow Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and 6 other South American countries to enter briefs into the Arizona immigration case. I wonder if you could explain what the background of that whole thing, including that decision, is.
And don't get me started on the Arizona law. But what you have to understand, the reason you see the South American countries isn't so much that they've got that much immigration. Brazil now has never had that. And Brazil is doing so well, they don't want to come here. The opportunities are there. Brazil is an amazing story in the last decade. But the reason is, I'll tell you, everybody in Latin America, especially when we talked about building the wall, said that was not aimed at Mexico, it was aimed at all of them. It was aimed at everything. They saw it as anti-Latino, not so much anti-Mexican. Now, I have a principle, which is that truth is not necessarily relevant. You know, don't argue them that that's not the case. That's how they see it. You got to understand why they see it that way. And they really, really, really do. I'd have to ask my daughter about the filing of the brief. She's the lawyer in the family, and darn good one, but and does nothing but Supreme Court cases, so I think she could probably answer the question. But filing a brief does not necessarily mean you're going to have any influence on anybody. It's amazing how many friends of the court, amicus curiae briefs you get in some cases. I'm sure I've known cases where there's no possibility that the justices could read them all. You know, not in the rest of the lifetime they have. These things can pile up forever and ever and ever. A good part of this is done for domestic reasons, you know. Look, I don't think it's going to have any impact on the final decision. Mexico's a little different case. Mexico is involved in this. The Arizona law, which I think is in some ways badly flawed and has real dangers. Here we go again, yeah? The Arizona law nevertheless reflects one of the fundamental problems of federalism, and that is that immigration is a federal matter, but the costs come to the states. I mean, I really learned this in Miami with the Cubans and Haitians, you know. They pay the bills, and that produces extreme frustration. That also happens to be constitutionally the law. You know? What can states do about it? What should they do about it? They react in ways that are understandable, but ways that may be counterproductive, ways which may be constitutionally illegal, ways which may be highly discriminatory. I will never forget, I did my grad work in New Mexico, and I go back there when I get a chance. I love New Mexico. I've got a friend who's a weaver up north of, between Taos and Santa Fe. And his family was one of the original ones. They came there in the 17th century. Santa Fe is the oldest capital city in the US, not Boston. You know? His family has been there. His family fought on the Union side in the Civil War. And this guy was being given absolute hell coming back in the US on a trip by somebody who was pretty obvious was at the most second generation. You know? He was, to put it mildly, offended. You know? It was, you know, my family fought for the Union of the Civil War. What was your family doing then? Planting potatoes. I mean, this is, you know. Most Mexicans are here legally. In a lot of cases, they've been here for generations. Generations and generations. And this law tends to hit all of them, and they feel it. They really do. You've got to, first of all, understand the frustration of Arizona and why it's so frustrated, and what on earth we can do to fix the system that does that. But this is a very hard thing to fix. Because today's world, you can't close off. if you open your border to legal trade, you open it to other trade. You try to really clamp down on the border, you do two things. You disrupt our own economy, and you shove more and more people into the hands of organized crime to get here. You know, those are your immediate consequences. Don't fool yourself. Oh, and you send more people into the desert to die. You know, which is a wonderful Christian response. We won't go into that. You know, there's no good answer to this system. You know, what you get time after time, regardless of, are people who offer simple solutions. You know, whether it's give amnesty and let everybody in, which is, you know, you can't do that. You know, give up any control over who comes in, forget that, you know. Or whether it's try to keep everybody out and slam the border. There was a thing that actually passed the House. Thank goodness the Senate was not in that same version of insanity a few years ago, which was going to make illegal immigration a felony. Every judge in the country went, can you picture the court agendas? Can you picture and they all get the right to a lawyer at our expense. You know, you looked at this law and you said, you know, these are the people who prescribe the guillotine for a headache. There are no simple solutions. You know, any solution is going to create, Millett's first law, another set of problems for you that you haven't dealt with today. So, yeah, you're going to get instant reactions to this. And the point is, first of all, a lot of what you hear doesn't make much difference, like Brazil. They're doing it for Brazilian reasons. Secondly, you know, there is no easy answer to this. There's no easy answer. The Arizona law is not the answer, but leaving the status quo isn't the answer either. And the biggest problem, again, is that while presidents, I got to know the Mexican ambassador to Denmark, who was actually a Mexican scholar, and her husband was also an ambassador to Finland. You know, very well, very bright lady. Got her to, I was teaching in Denmark a couple of years ago, holding the extinguished chair of American Studies. She came and talked and was, I've never seen a Mexican official dishonest, maybe because we were in Denmark. I mean, no, I don't mean as opposed to dishonest. I mean this open and this, and she was saying bluntly, this was during the Bush, at the end of the Bush period. She said, neither president has any control over this. Neither president can do what's sensible. The media is out of control. Their own political parties are out of control. You know, local prejudices. You know, you just can't do this. It has gone beyond the control of the governments. And she was absolutely right. Yes.
I can be your brother.
Thank you for a very informative talk. A number of years ago, one area that was a concern in terms of hemispheric security was the tri-border region of South America. And I don't know what the status of that concern is now, but I'm wondering, is it a totally separate problem, or are there connections between these kind of security issues that crop up, you know, in one place in the hemisphere and security issues that we see in other areas?
What place were you saying was the problem?
The tri-border region.
Oh yeah, of course. That's fun. Oh, I've been there. Good place to go meet Hezbollah. But not that they're doing that much. It was R&R in part. Paraguay is a strange place. I spent a fair amount of time in Paraguay. It really is. It's interesting. It's the only place I know of where the classified ads have two kinds of cars, those with papers and those without. And the second category is the largest, and they're called Mau cars, and they're all stolen from Argentina and Brazil. Paraguay historically has lived off of smuggling. It used to be always cigarettes, and you know, if you looked at the importation figures for Paraguay, where there was almost no import tax, the average Paraguayan smoked 2 cartons of cigarettes a day and drank a quart of whiskey. You know, it was not. You know, this was all going to Argentina and Brazil, and little bits to Bolivia. You know, mostly there. The tri-border region is a very strange, unique place. There have been real efforts to clamp down on this, been made off limits to American military personnel. I'm sorry, you can't go there, but it's not as violent. It's not it's all that. It can be dangerous, but there's a lot more dangerous places in the world. It simply, again, reflects what that the weak always have ways of dealing with things, and Paraguay's always been weak, and it's made a great living out of smuggling. They got up to number 2 on the Transparency Index of Corruption. Their slogan was, we're maybe number 2, but we try harder. And they proved that by scamming the Nigerians, which I thought was amazing. It's not as big a problem as we make it sometimes. It's an issue. But there's lots of places like this around the world, you know. I mean, Panama's got problems. Not as obvious, not as big. But Panama's a big port. Ports have problems. Ports attract people who want to do illegal things as well as legal things. You can go back and watch Marlon Brando and On the Waterfront if you don't. I mean, this is gone. Look at the history of Newark. I mean, look at the history of Miami. This is the way ports are. They really are. And in this world of incredible commerce, it just gets more and more and more. It's not a haven for terrorists. They do some business there. I think more money laundering than anything else. But you can do, believe me, you've got a lot of choices for money laundering. You may go where it's the easiest and the least dangerous, but it ain't gonna stop. It's just like drug trafficking. You have all sorts of ways to get drugs here. And when we clamped down on one, we had the head of the CIA once literally in front of Congress say, this is the balloon factor, What happens when you squeeze a balloon at one end? Bulges out at the other. This is what happens with this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's an interesting study. It really is. And it really reflects Paraguayan history. Paraguay brought in a former bishop, had to leave bishop, to be their president. They're going to finally get an honest president. What they discovered was he'd had several kids. Well, his various women, with his help, had several kids. It's probably a better way of putting it, which was not exactly what they had in mind in terms of the upright bishop, but that's another story. Yeah, here.
Oh, I've got a loud enough voice, that's fine. You had mentioned just a moment ago about squeezing one end of the balloon to the apparent success with clamp down on drug trade, corruption, kidnapping.
Kidnapping, yes.
Do you see any parallel model that might be applied to Mexico that would be successful?
I have a former student who would send you an essay on Colombianization of Mexico, which she argued. Unfortunately, she made it in front of political scientists who didn't like it.
Okay.
But
I'm not familiar with
no, I know. I'm going to look. There are things you can learn from Mexico and from Colombia that the Mexicans have tried. One of the keys for Colombia was actually establishing an effective government presence in every municipality. It was never been done before. Another thing was that things got so bad that the Colombian middle upper classes actually got frightened themselves and started being willing to pay something of a price to deal with this. That when we first got involved with Colombia, we being the US, deep with these conflicts, Colombia had a law, they had a draft, filled the military with a draft, but if you were a high school graduate, you were exempt. That didn't go down well, but it took years to change it. And you may now get drafted, but believe me, you're not sent out to the jungle. Mexico has some interestingly similar kinds of situations, and obligatory service for teachers and doctors, especially doctors. But there are lessons from Colombia. Colombia's done pretty darn well on kidnapping. Colombia has been helped by the fact that, first of all, these people, again, a little like Mexico, the paramilitaries, the drug dealers, and the guerrillas were all busily engaged in fighting over the same routes and killing each other. As I said, I lived and taught in Colombia, and one of my students was I don't want to say mistress, and I can't say wife. Colombia at that point had an agreement with the Vatican if you could get divorced, but you couldn't get remarried. So they'd been living together for many years, but they couldn't get married. So it was always tough to try to figure out what you called her. I called her La Senora, which was about the best thing. Very nice lady, very bright. She was in one of my graduate seminars, and he was the leading columnist for one of the big papers and later became their ambassador to China. And he drove me around. This was when the drug trade was just really getting going, when it still was mostly marijuana before our chase changed. And showing me the mansions and stuff and saying, what the drug dealers do is they pay these guys with guns, you know. And they said they bring in 3 piles of guns. 1 pile they give to the guerrillas for protection. 1 pile they give to the paramilitaries to kill the guerrillas, and the 3rd pile they keep themselves to kill everybody. I said, well, boy, that's a recipe for it. And it was, and we saw what happened in the next few years. But the fights among them have been part of it. The unique personality of Uribe, it was the ultimate statement that the reason he got elected president, the major reason, was that he had credibility in his determination to fight these guys. And the reason he had credibility is they'd killed his father. You know? That gave him, what is the major qualification for being president is to have your father murdered. Well, they were right. This was personal. This was family, you know, and he was out to get him. The Colombian military is a lot better. They have a lot more experience. There's some very, very good people, very, very bright officers. It's the only military in Latin America that fought in Korea. Most people don't know that. The Mexicans, incidentally, fought in the Pacific in World War II. People don't know that either. We have a lot of facts we tend to miss. And the Brazilians sent an entire reinforced division, which they rotated through, to Italy. That's I got to tell that story. It has nothing to do with your question, but I've got to. You know, supposedly Hitler, when he heard that Brazil had declared war, said, "Ha! The day we see a Brazilian soldier in Europe, we'll see snakes smoking pipes." The patch of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force is a snake smoking a pipe. And it's also available on Brazilian postage stamps. It's a lovely patch. I've always appreciated that. But the Colombian military was in some ways more professional at the top. They didn't have the tradition of one-party rule. Colombia is a very diverse economy that didn't depend on drugs at all. Mexico's very diverse too. I mean, that's, again, it's not a failed state. It's doing very well in some areas. There are limits. One of Uribe's big strengths was the fact that he came from outside the traditional party structure. You know, this is not true in Mexico. Colombia is a federal republic. States did have authority, but not as federal as Mexico. And finally, Colombia had that one great advantage: it had no border with the United States.
One quick question. You mentioned that there's no easy solutions here,
Oh boy.
but the status quo isn't good enough. So is this an intractable problem, and what do you propose that we have to do about it?
I have a one-man crusade. I'll tell you what Paul thinks about this. I want to get rid of the term national security policy and substitute managed insecurity policy. Because that's what we do. You know, the idea that some set of policies can make you secure has got to be the biggest lie ever foisted on the American people. Would you agree or not, Paul?
I'll go with you.
Yeah, and this is nonsense. We're managing insecurity. That's what you've got to do. You know, the Colombian thing took a long time and was very incremental and has not solved the problems, but it has made this insecurity much more manageable and the life of the average Colombian more secure. It's done that. You can do things, but again, doing them too fast is almost as bad as not doing anything at all. You know, there is no problem so bad that an idiot with a plan for fixing it quickly and cheaply can't make it worse. So again, yeah, you've got to, patience is the first requirement, and we're never very long on that. I mean, the world ends at the next congressional election. We all know that now. Yeah.
How opposed is Mexico to duplicating Colombia's success in, say, raids against cartels? Like there was the raid in Ecuador, and also the recent raid against, I guess his name was Jojoy, their FARC's military leader, in which both instances they seized, vast amounts of data that have really helped them crack down against the FARC. I mean, is Mexico at all pursuing raids like this? I mean, is that even possible?
Pardon me. I don't quite know how to. Mexico's Mexico. Mexico's distinct from any place else. Very, very distinct. One of the interesting things, I've got all these laws I'm threatening to send to the Air Force Academy. The Marine Corps uses them at Command and Staff College, and one of them is very simple. It says, look, it is always, underline always 3 times, a bad idea to use the military in the role of police. Sometimes it's a worse idea not to use them. That's back to menos mal. You don't have good options here. The Mexicans are now using the Marines more and more, and that's not a very big Marine Corps. Because they're not infiltrated, They can send them any place they want. Nobody expects the Marines to show up, in the middle of the desert, but they have. But the more you use them, the more these institutions become subject to. Also, we have had literally major firefights between military and police units in Mexico. That doesn't get much publicity here, but that has happened. We've had shootouts between federal and state police. This is, and of course, one thing the Mexicans, you want to really destroy Mexico, send one drone over there. Get the gringos involved directly in any of this stuff. And, the game between them and us is essentially over. The levels of suspicion and historical problems are so high. You think it's bad in Pakistan, try it in Mexico. We do, the other real issue that comes up is how do you share intel when you're convinced that at least much of this stuff could be penetrated and the intel you share can go to the wrong people. That's tough. You turn the camera off?
The success of the Colombians in managing insecurity to the benefit of public safety and welfare. The Colombian model is generally the model being imposed by U.S. Special Ops, FBI, and DEA in Afghanistan now.
Maybe it's one we're following.
Eradication. So I think there may be I'm curious about how you see their perception of what you describe as management of insecurity.
Yeah.
As
well, we're
something
talking
else. And finally, how your view of that is received in the briefings that you give in Congress.
A few things again about the Colombian situation that are really, I think, no matter what side you think you're coming from, badly misunderstood. First, the Colombians had a heck of a lot more experience than we did in this stuff in recent years. They've been fighting this for a long time. We hadn't fought any of this since Vietnam when this got started. We had maybe more to learn from them than they had to learn from us. Their problems were badly underfunded, low troop morale, and the national police, they weren't as corrupt as many in Latin America, but they'd go into a town and they'd simply barricade themselves, and then the guerrillas would come and fire these propane cylinders at them, which would usually miss and blow up poor Jose's house 2 blocks away. So the last, if you wanted insecurity, you wanted the police post in your town, because all it did was got propane cylinders fired in there. You had to get them out of the barracks, you had to get them patrolling. That's part of it. You had to get these people on the ground. But you had to have the government offering something else. And one of the keys was also saying, look, you guys, we've got to give something to the guys who quit the guerrillas or the paramilitaries. The Colombian military never liked the paras, but the paras were killing the people who were trying to kill the military, and they were certainly not your prime target as a result. But the second you got anything else, you got the guerrillas under control, the military does not want a competing armed force. And the paras were the next on the list. And again, that was not widely understood here. This was not an alliance it was, we need somebody to kill the people who are trying to kill me. And the paras got worse and worse and more drug involved every year. They got demobilized. A lot of them probably became their own mini cartels because we broke up the big ones. Highly predictable. Happens in almost every guerrilla conflict. But the Colombians learned you had to give guys an alternative who quit. They had to believe their chances of staying alive were better if they quit than if they continued, because the paradigm had always been up till then, your chances of staying alive were better if you kept fighting, because if you quit, you were going to get killed. And they changed that. They changed that perception, and that's been a key. They both made it much more dangerous to keep fighting and much less dangerous to quit. It's still dangerous to quit, but not nearly, most of the guys who quit don't get killed. That's the way of the world, people, and not a nice, The other thing is I always keep saying is, look, remember, these guys, especially the cartel people, if drugs weren't illegal, they'd all become Sunday school teachers. Yeah, just like all the people in Chicago when we ended Prohibition became Sunday school. Yeah, I'm sorry, these guys already are doing 20 other kinds of crime. They will simply, first of all, drugs are always going to be, some kinds of drugs are always going to be illegal, and drugs are always going to be illegal for big classes of people like kids and, pregnant. There's always going to be a market. But secondly, they got so much other stuff to do. It is an almost insoluble question, but I lean heavily. The question is, are these people criminal because of the drug laws, or do they break the drug laws because they're already criminals? And I tend to lean to the second. I would strongly urge all of you. I forgot to bring it in from my hotel room. I can maybe leave a site with whoever takes me back tonight because I got the copy. It's over a year ago, but Harper's Magazine ran a wonderful article, wonderful if you don't want to sleep. The Confessions of a Sicario, of one of the hired killers for the Juarez cartel. Very detailed. Nothing in it that surprised me. Things that absolutely horrified all sorts of other people, including the fact that they hired doctors so they could torture people longer before they died. You need to read this to understand some of the mentality which you've got. There's a wonderful chapter in a book written by a Colombian colonel called Miguel in Medellin. It's unfortunately few copies exist, and certainly I may have one of about 3 or 4 in this country. But he has a chapter on there on El culto de muerte y la generación de no futuro, the worship of death and the generation without a future, which is much of the urbanized poor kids in the world today. They got drugs are bad for you. None of them expect to live beyond their mid-20s. None of their friends do. They're the generation of no future. So they'll do anything at the moment. They'll kill anybody, in the Colombian case, to get their mother a refrigerator. The only loyalty they have. You've got to understand the mentality of what you can do to an urban generation that's rejected the rural values of their family, second generation often, has no values of their own, sees no opportunity, and has never had any reason to see the law as anything, but they're out there to beat them up.
Joe was kind enough to allow me a question here. First of all, I want to comment that I appreciate your comment on management of insecurity as the basis for national security. I think I'm going to adopt that. But be that as it may, and in our conversation coming over here tonight, the relation to Afghanistan and Pakistan is a central question now beyond Mexico and on American agenda. I reflect historically that President Wilson sent General Pershing to Mexico to try to find Pancho Villa. Presidents Bush and Obama might like to find Osama bin Laden, but in any event, separating the Al-Qaeda from Taliban in principle being our strategic objective. I'd like you to comment from your experiences in the U.S. and Mexico and U.S. experience in Afghanistan and Pakistan, since I know you know about that. And so I appreciate your comments.
I could talk a lot about the Pershing expedition. I'm doing some writing on it. I'm writing a book on U.S. interventions from the Boxer Rebellion through Iraq called It's for Their Own Good. Slight cynical title. Anyway, and Pershing's obviously a chapter in this, but Pershing is something that shows all the problems of trying to use high tech. You get pictures of Pershing crossing the border on a horse. Actually, he drove to the border in a Packard touring car, got off, rode across the border on the horse, and then got back in the Packard. But he got the first airplane group to go with him. The trouble was that these airplanes were very early modeled, and they had a ceiling for flying of about 6,000 feet. Much of the northern Mexican plateau was above that, which created real problems in trying to take off. He never found them. He got in the way of the Mexican efforts to deal with it. He did have a big battle with the Mexican army, which he lost, the last cavalry charge in U.S. history, which we don't want to go into. And as a result, he was given the command in Europe. it's amazing what the press can do with things. And his aide was a man named Patton, who knew that when you saw a Mexican, he had to be an enemy. So not only did he shoot them, but he tied them to the bumpers of his car and drove around with them like deer. Yeah, it's. I do like Pershing for lots of things. He once said that he thought Arthur MacArthur was the most conceited man he ever met till he met his son Douglas. There are things to be learned from this, and mostly they're really, the problems of when you get involved in somebody else's civil war are immense. Immense. You try to solve the Civil War, they're immense. Nobody believes you're neutral, nobody wants you to be neutral. The wars are always a lot more complicated, and they're involved hundreds of issues that you don't, we like to look at something called big ideological issues. In local areas, these are down to family feuds and water rights and who knows what else. So from Pershing, because that expedition absolutely accomplished nothing, lost its only major battle, never saw Pancho Villa, and demonstrated the limitations of air power when the ceiling was below the level of the ground. It also showed one of the principles, which is one of the laws that I use in the Marine Corps quotes, and that is simply that it is always, always easier to insert troops than it is to get them out.
Thank you, Dick.